C. Payne Lucas, in telling the story of the thievery of government money in the United States at the beginning, did you mean to suggest that corruption in the United States is the equivalent of corruption in much of Africa? And by saying for every Mobutu, you also have more great politicians, do you mean to differ greatly from George Ayittey's estimate that of the 54 countries in Africa, only 16 of them are democracies? I hope I got those numbers right.
No, I was surprised that we had 16 democracies in Africa. I don't think Nigeria was exactly a democracy under President Obasanjo, but I have to really give him a great deal of respect for the fact that he managed a nation of 150 million people without any great fall down of war and decadence. And on top of that, he appointed a woman by the name of Minister Ngozi who went out and looked for corruption. So when you start to think like that and change like that, the message is getting through. You don't ignore Nigeria. And when you start to talk about aid, let's not forget, when you talk about $600 billion of that, how much of that went to Egypt and Israel? We have to support those places because we have strategic interests in those places. And sometimes aid itself is not related. It's related to maintaining our relationships. So those cannot be ignored.
George Ayittey, you said that Africans want three things: reform, reform, and reform. Economic reform, political reform, and intellectual reform. Do the United States or the United Nations have a role to play in that, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, let me address some of the comments made by C. Payne Lucas, and that is, look, take Nigeria, for example. Please do not minimize the issue of corruption. It is a very serious problem that we have in Africa. Take Nigeria, for example. Between 1970 and 2000, more than 450 billion in oil revenue flowed into Nigerian government coffers. Now, according to Nuhu Maram Ribadu, the chairman of Nigeria's Anti-Corruption Commission, of that amount of money, 412 billion was stolen by Nigeria's military rulers. It's a huge amount of money. Sure, certainly we can point to Ngozi, who has been a reformer, but what did the Obasanjo regime do to reward her? They sacked her. And now, if you look across Africa as a whole, the African Union itself says that corruption alone costs Africa $148 billion every year. Now, that's more than 5 times the foreign aid Africa receives from all sources. So the issue, as a matter of fact, Africa doesn't need aid. The aid resources Africa needs can be found right there in Africa.
Well, I want to make clear, if you think that this corruption in Nigeria drew out of Obasanjo's regime, I think you're wrong.
I didn't say that.
We all know Sani Abacha was the person who stole all the money in Nigeria, but the Nigerians, we got rid of him too, didn't we? Every time we find corrupt politicians...
Sani Abacha was worth $5 billion. Babangida, $8 billion. You can go all the way back. Now, this didn't start, okay, recently. It started all the way back since the 1970s.
Oh, I don't disagree with you. You got to remember one thing. In this country alone, and in the world, Korea and Tehran and Japan, and from the Civil War all the way up to Teddy Roosevelt, corruption was rampant in this country, but these countries still grew. They still became powerful countries. Corruption alone does not destroy a country. It's the amount of corruption. We'll never eliminate it completely, but we can set in motion the conditions that will help eliminate this terrible thing.
Please let the
Africans... And that's why the Africans now have created something called NEPAD, too.
Let the Africans decide for themselves how bad corruption is. And that's this sort of comparative analysis doesn't help us. If you try to place corruption within Washington context, for example, certainly there is corruption in D.C. government. And now the latest toll is that $43 million have disappeared because of tax fraud. But please don't compare that to Africa. Let the Africans themselves determine the incidence of corruption and how important it is to them.
And briefly, Professor Ayittey, on the question of the role in reform that the U.S. or UN would have to play?
Well, the United States, the World Bank, United Nations can be helpful in reforming, trying to help Africa reform. But in the past, they've been more of a hindrance. And that is one of the, look, if you want to reform Africa, there are 6 basic institutions that you need. Number 1, you need an independent and free media. That's the first critical institution. Americans take their media for granted. The second institution that you need is an independent judiciary for the rule of law. The third institution that you need is an independent electoral commission. 4, you need an independent, you need to have an independent central bank. And then you want to have a neutral and professional armed forces and an efficient civil service. Give Africans these 6 institutions and it will do most of the cleaning out of Africa.